Are knights and heavy cavalry the same in the medieval world? What does May actually mean? What was the percentage of knights in an army? Greetings, my young count. I am your loyal advisor, Shinbai. I've heard you will soon join His Majesty's campaign, so I have brought you some special intelligence on army composition. If you find this helpful, please show your approval and grant me 2 coins, a token of victory and friendship. Before diving deep into the warfare of this era, many people assume knights are the same as heavy cavalry, and that all heavy cavalry are knights. In fact, in most cases, knights were almost always clad in the finest armor of their time. They also almost always fought as heavy cavalry on the battlefield, or rather, shock cavalry, charging into combat with lances. However, for most of the medieval period, elite cavalry who were also heavily armored, rode war horses, and charged with lances, did not necessarily hold the title of knight, especially in the late Middle Ages. With the advent of plate armor and the mass production of individual equipment, more and more armed men could be equipped similarly to knights, or even with identical gear. They would fight as charging heavy cavalry. Consequently, a new concept was born, the MAA. This stands for man-at-arms. The term originates from the French homme d'armes. It's a purely military concept, based only on a warrior's equipment and skill, and is unrelated to social class. Compared to knight or heavy cavalry, the scope of man-at-arms is much broader. It refers to a class of warrior in heavy armor, proficient with various weapons, who usually served as heavy shock cavalry. They could fight on horseback, or sometimes dismount to fight on foot. They could also serve as powerful infantry in sieges or defense. I can say with certainty, almost all knights were men-at-arms. But not all men-at-arms were knights. In fact, a large portion of them were not knights. Heavy cavalry, however, were definitely men-at-arms. But men-at-arms did not always fight as cavalry. They could also be heavy infantry. Likewise, the relationship between heavy cavalry and knights is similar. You need to understand the relationships and differences here. This will ensure you are confident when discussing tactics. In the Kingdom of England, between 1280 and 1360, knights made up 20% to 30% of all men-at-arms. Afterward, this percentage gradually fell. In other words, the number of non-knight men-at-arms was rising. By 1380, it had dropped to 6.5%, and by 1443, within the Duke of Somerset's army, only 1.3% of men-at-arms were knights. From a military standpoint, after the 14th century, knights evolved from being simply elite cavalry to becoming junior officers, or even high-level commanders. Around 1350, in the army of Edward III, the commander of a large force might only hold the title of knight or squire. However, because the requirements for a warrior's training and quality of equipment were high, most men-at-arms were still men of some social standing. Besides the core group of knights, they could also be knight squires, veteran mercenaries, and in some cases, wealthy soldiers who could afford the required equipment could also become men-at-arms. These soldiers were generally used as light cavalry or as low-ranking infantry commanders. Furthermore, the non-heir, descendants of barons, and knights also often became men-at-arms. In 1415, the English Lord Scrope provided the king with 30 men-at-arms. This included 1 knight banneret, who was Scrope himself, 3 regular knights, and 26 squires. The gentry class, which formed in the 14th century, became the main source of men-at-arms. In late medieval France, the crown even passed edicts to organize men-at-arms into standing companies, the famous companies d'ordonnance. In terms of equipment, men-at-arms were generally clad in the finest armor of their time. Before the 14th century, this was mainly chainmail. From the 14th century on, transitional platan mail became the norm. After the 15th century, full plate armor gradually became common. So, a warrior in full plate was not necessarily a knight. He could also be a man-at-arms without a knightly title. The primary weapon of a man-at-arms was the lance. In the 14th century, it was about 12 feet long and was typically made of ash wood. Later, to counter the improvements in armor, heavy lances weighing up to 40 pounds became the standard. They could be fixed to a lance rest on the breastplate, of course. Not all men-at-arms used such a heavy weapon. Lighter lances were also frequently used when fighting on foot. They used lances shortened to about 5 feet, or polearms like two-handed battle axes. Additionally, in the 14th century, there were instances of men-at-arms on foot, where two men would wield a single, full-length lance. The warhorse was another of the man-at-arms' most vital assets. Generally, they used destriers and coursers. The faster and more agile coursers were far more common. Overall, the choice of horse depended on the personal wealth of the man-at-arms. Between 1282 and 1364, across 13 English military campaigns, the average value of a man-at-arms horse was between 7.6 and 16.4 pounds. In the mid-15th century, a horse for a French man-at-arms cost the equivalent of 6 months' pay. These expensive mounts had to be purchased by the soldiers themselves. So monarchs would often, during a war, establish a compensation system for war horses to reimburse soldiers who lost their mounts in battle. From the 13th century on, this system was quite mature. Before a campaign, the army would appraise the quality and value of each soldier's horse to facilitate compensation after the war. Furthermore, in the late Middle Ages, the horses of men-at-arms were more commonly fitted with barding. King Edward of England once ordered that his men-at-arms must use barded horses. Of course, barding at that time was mainly mail, but could also be made of leather or textile. Starting in the 15th century, plate barding began to see wider use. Next, we can examine the man-at-arms, tactical role, and combat effectiveness. In medieval warfare, men-at-arms played a critical role on many different types of battlefields. Their most conventional role was as heavy cavalry, acting as the army's general reserve, charging at the decisive moment to crush the enemy. At the Battle of Benevento in 1266, Charles of Anjou, King of Sicily for the papal forces, led 3,000 men-at-arms. For each mounted man-at-arms, he assigned to infantrymen to protect any cavalryman who was unhorsed and to kill any dismounted enemy soldiers. These warriors, riding powerful war horses and clad in heavy armor, also possessed physical conditioning far beyond the average man. You, who are about to plunge into war, should also train your body to this same standard. Starting in the 14th century, due to changes on the battlefield, men-at-arms fighting on foot became increasingly common, especially within the Kingdom of England. Dismounted men-at-arms, when these men advanced on foot, they would grip their lances or other polearms tightly. 6 months before Agincourt, on April 29, 1415, lords signed contracts with the king in London, confirming how many soldiers they would provide for the coming war. These soldiers would serve for 1 year, and a quarter of their pay would be delivered up front. The remaining 3 payments were made quarterly. During the Agincourt campaign, a man-at-arms who wasn't a knight was paid 12 pence a day. In this war, the largest contingent was from the Duke of Clarence, Thomas, who provided 240 men-at-arms. In garrison campaigns, a higher ratio of men-at-arms was likely. In France at the same time, the proportion of men-at-arms was notably higher. In 1415, the French Dauphin ordered the Dukes of Orleans and Burgundy to each send 500 men-at-arms and 300 archers. Incidentally, the status of men-at-arms and archers was clearly different before the Battle of Agincourt. Henry V issued an order demanding silence from the army at night. A man-at-arms who disobeyed would forfeit his equipment. An archer, however, would have an ear cut off. When garrisoning a castle, men-at-arms were also the core fighting force. In 1265, the rebel Earl Simon de Montfort dispatched Robert de Ross to lead 300 men-at-arms to garrison Gloucester. The royal army launched a fierce assault on the city. After capturing the outer walls, Robert, without having made any preparations or supplies, still relied on his 300 men-at-arms to hold the castle for 15 days. In 1414, when the Earl of Warwick garrisoned Calais, his command included 240 men-at-arms and between 274 to 330 for archers. Due to the vital role of men-at-arms on the battlefield, many famous figures emerged from their ranks. In the 14th century, John Hawkwood and his company, while serving Baron Mortimer in the Welsh marches, transitioned from being archers to becoming men-at-arms. Many lords and even high-ranking nobles would, during wartime, personally serve on campaign as men-at-arms. For instance, at Agincourt, Edward, Duke of York, was one of the most famous warriors in the Kingdom of England. Of course, there are also less inspiring examples. During the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the young cavalry commander, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, rashly charged ahead of his men. Soon after the fighting started, his horse was brought down by Scottish spearmen, and once unhorsed, he was killed by the Scots. Ironically, of the 500 men-at-arms he brought with him, he was the only one killed in action. In summary, the man-at-arms was a pivotal force in the warfare of this era. Knowing the number and proportion of men-at-arms in both armies is critical to understanding the balance of power and even the enemy's tactical intentions. This information is absolutely key. Therefore, I implore you, you must master all information and intelligence regarding men-at-arms. I wish you a swift and total victory in the coming war. Until next time.